Sometimes, in high fantasy, you want to go all the way. You want a fully created world. Myths, legends, monsters, and all the grand, sweeping elements of the genre. But how do you reconcile that with an ancient past? How do you bring high fantasy and deep history together to achieve a cohesive whole that serves your story? In the last episode of Worldbuilding Your Ancient Lore, we explored how to use Earth's history as a template, the gradual rise and fall of civilizations grounded in historical patterns. But today, we're stepping away from that grounded approach. We're diving into the genius of Tolkien's worldbuilding and exploring how you can break free from historical constraints, embracing high fantasy in all its mythic grandeur. Welcome to episode 4 of Just in Time Worldbuilding series on ancient lore with your host, Marie Mullaney. So far in this series, we've talked about grounded ancient lore, how civilizations rise and fall, how layers of history shape the present, and how cultural and economic forces drive slow, believable change. We've explored how real-world history, as well as the Song of Ice and Fire, uses these forces to create evolving civilizations that shift gradually over time. There are no clear-cut lines between eras, just long epochs of change. But Tolkien's approach was entirely different. While he still layered ancient history into his world, something we'll get into in a bit, his world building wasn't based on the gradual cultural evolution of real-world civilizations. Instead, it was rooted in mythological deep time. In Tolkien's world, history isn't just shaped by mortal actions, but by Eru, the Valar, the Maiar, and other cosmic events. And rather than a story of technological progress, his world is built on decline. Civilizations don't advance, they fade. Knowledge is lost, magic becomes more distant. Over time, people lose touch with their mythic past, both culturally and spiritually. There's also a deep sense of absolute good existing and a moral framework of right versus wrong underpinning everything. And this makes sense when you consider Tolkien's deep Christian beliefs, which influence these moral and spiritual undertones woven throughout The Lord of the Rings. But there's another key element to this world building, something we today call the rule of cool. Sometimes the best reason for world building is simply because it's awesome. I was watching an old BBC interview with Tolkien, and the interviewer asked him if he built Middle-earth to express a grand thematic idea, something about good versus evil, perhaps. And Tolkien just stared at him. You could practically see the word idiot hovering in the air behind his very polite Oxford demeanour. And then he said, in that understated British way, "I built the world before I had the story." The interviewer, clearly confused, pushed further. But why? And Tolkien, looking at the interviewer like he'd grown a second head, replied, "Because I enjoyed it." Today, I suppose Tolkien would just say, "Because it's cool, you moron." Tolkien didn't create Middle-earth as a mere backdrop for a story. He built it because he loved it, because he was fascinated by languages, by how they evolved, by the worlds they implied. That's why Elvish has so many dialects. That's why Middle-earth feels so deep and real. So, Middle-earth isn't a setting. It's a mythological framework. And in this episode, we're going to contrast Tolkien's method with the grounded historical world building we discussed last time. We'll break down how he layers history through myth, not realism, and why decline and loss are central to his world, and why you should embrace the rule of cool in your own world building. Okay, let's crack on with deep time versus historical evolution. So we've established that Tolkien's world history doesn't evolve in a purely natural way. Instead, it's structured like a grand mythological narrative, divided into distinct ages, each marked by a cosmic shift. Unlike in our world, where myths are cultural expressions that shape how we remember history, in Tolkien's world, myths are reality. That's how history actually works. So let's just cover these ages very briefly so we're all on the same page. In the first age, we had gods, heroes, and the shaping of the world. This is the age of divine beings and legendary figures. The world is being shaped by the Valar, the godlike entities of Tolkien's cosmology. It's also when the first great civilizations arrive, such as the elves of Valinor and the mighty kingdom of Numenor. This is the era of epic conflicts. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, wages war against the free peoples, setting the stage for all future struggles. Quick side note, anybody who says that Tolkien's world is not fantastical has not read the first age. Okay? The world was created flat. It only later became round. It was later shaped to be round. But in the first age, it was flat. And the reason why the elves have got that whole elven eye thing, the reason why, like, when Aragorn says, "What do your elvish eyes see?" What it actually means is like elves, in their perception, the earth is still flat. So they don't have to deal with the curvature of the earth. So they see as though the earth is flat. And that is so unbelievably freaking cool piece of lore. And if that is not fantastical, I don't know what is. Anyway, so that was the first age. Now, the second age was the rise and fall of Numenor. And this age is all about hubris. Numenor reaches the height of its power, but ultimately falls because its people try to claim immortality. Something we'll dive into more later. This is also when the rings of power are forged and Sauron deceives the world, and the age ends with a last alliance of elves and men, where Sauron is defeated, but not destroyed, because Isildur fails to destroy the One Ring. The second age is kinda maybe the foundation for the Rings of Power TV series. They draw on some of the elements of it. Let's not get... Actually, do get into it. Get into it in the comments. Fight each other. It's great for engagement. But yeah, they're loosely inspired by the second age. The third age is the fading of magic and the end of myth. And that is in fact where the actual big stories are set. This is where we see the waning of Middle-earth's legendary past. Magic fades, the elves leave. Gondor is just a shadow of Numenor's former glory. This age is all about decline. Most of what came before is now legend, and legend fades into history. This is the age of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the final days of myth before Middle-earth fully transitions into the dominion of men. Okay, so let's talk about that cyclical history versus gradual evolution. Now, contrast this with A Song of Ice and Fire, which we discussed in the last episode. The difference is pretty stark. Martin's world follows gradual evolution. Civilizations rise and fall due to political and economic forces. There are no absolutes, there are no mythic dividing lines. But in Middle-earth, history is cyclical. Each age ends with a major catastrophe. The next age is always less magical, less grand, and more mortal. These aren't slow incremental shifts. There are clear dramatic cutoffs. On one side of the dividing line, the world is one way. On the other side, it's completely different. Of course, some things do change gradually, like the elves slowly leaving Middle-earth, but there is a sharp distinction between the second and the third age and the first and the second. So if you want your fantasy world to feel mythic, consider using these kinds of grand, world-changing moments rather than the slow burn of real-world history. All right. Next up, let's talk about Tolkien's themes, particularly why decline and loss of knowledge was so central to his world building. Before we get into that, let me just briefly tell you how to get even more out of this channel. If you become a member of the channel by hitting the join button right here on YouTube, then for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you will get worksheets to help your world building, exclusive member live streams, and early access to all my content. And you will be helping to provide some stability to this channel to guard against the vagaries of the advertising revenue income that YouTube shares with me for people viewing my content. And thank you very much to all of my members who make it possible for me to continue doing this. Okay, back to Tolkien. A key feature of Middle-earth is how each race ties into the thematic elements, as well as the overall decline theme. So let's break down how these themes play out and what you can learn from them. First, the fading of the elves. The elves are the most closely tied with the decline of magic theme, in my opinion. They are immortal, but a diminishing civilization. In the First Age, they were at their pinnacle, filled with beauty, wisdom, and magic. But over time, they fade. By the Third Age, they are leaving Middle-earth forever. And what the elves once created, men cannot replicate. The Palantiri, the rings of power, even the elven architecture, these are all irreplaceable relics of a lost era. Middle-earth isn't progressing, it's losing what it once was because of the decline of the elves. But speaking of men, let's discuss the fall of Numenor and the hubris of man. Numenor was the greatest kingdom of men, blessed with long life and mighty cities and advanced knowledge. But it was destroyed by its own arrogance. The Numenorians tried to claim immortality, sailing west in defiance of divine law. And for that, Eru Ilúvatar himself intervened. The entire island was sunk beneath the sea. The survivors of this catastrophe founded Gondor and Aranor, but these kingdoms were mere shadows of Numenor's former greatness. Even Aragorn's legacy is a fading echo of the last Golden Age. This is symbolized perfectly by the Sword of Narsil, once wielded by Elendil at the height of Numenor's power, now a broken relic waiting to be reforged. So men basically represent hubris, arrogance, and causing their own decline. Even Isildur not destroying the ring ties into that arrogance. Yes, the ring corrupted him, but he also believed he could wield it. Okay, so that's elves and men. What about the dwarves? Do they have some other themes? I'm so glad you asked. Let's talk about dwarves and the cost of greed. The dwarves once built legendary underground cities like Khazad-dûm, but their greed led them to dig too deep, awakening the Balrog, and they lost their homeland. By the Third Age, dwarven culture is scattered and struggling. Their great cities are abandoned. When the Fellowship journeys through Moria, all that remains is ruin. The theme of loss isn't just about knowledge, it's about the civilizations paying the price for their past mistake, paying for their sins. Each of these cultures embodies Tolkien's recurring themes. The past was greater than the present. The world is diminishing, losing its magic. The mythic age is ending, and the age of men, an age of lesser glory, is beginning. And then the dwarves and men also embody themes of greed and arrogance being morally deficient and leading to decline. Contrast this with A Song of Ice and Fire, where civilizations don't just decline, they rise, fall, and rebuild. Lost knowledge can sometimes be rediscovered, like when Dunarace hatches her dragons using Miri Mazdur's life as a means to fuel it. In Martin's world, magic returns after being lost. In Tolkien's world, magic fades forever. Moreover, in Martin's world, there are no absolutes one way or another. There are only the forces of politics, economics, and fantastical powers that shape the world one way or another. And for anybody who says there's no such thing as grey morality, observe, greed can get you everywhere in Martin's world, as it can in our world. On the other hand, in Tolkien's world, greed gets you Balrogged. That's the difference between black and white and grey. Okay, so what do we learn from this if we want to build a world like Tolkien? For me, it is important that you understand that your world doesn't have to follow a decline narrative, okay? Instead, what I want you to take away from all this is that you should align your world building with your themes. If you want your world to reflect a loss of past knowledge, Do it the way Tolkien did. Make it impossible to recreate the wonders of the past. But if you want a world where knowledge and magic advance, then shape your world building accordingly. Let civilizations build on past discoveries instead of losing them. Make them mighty in their magic as they study the divine, or whatever gives them magic. Whatever theme you choose, embed it into your races, your histories, and the myths that you make real. All right, now I do want to dive into the moral and spiritual aspects of Tolkien's world building. Firstly, because I think they're often misunderstood, and secondly, because you can't separate Tolkien's deep sense of morality and justice from the world that he built. So, I've already touched on this a little earlier. Things like the fall of Numenor reflects the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. The Numenorians reached for immortality, like eating from the forbidden tree, and they are punished for it. Tolkien's world building does draw from his faith, and his civilizations are often shaped by moral and spiritual forces. Eru Ilúvatar is a pretty clear stand-in for the Christian God, and in Tolkien's world, absolute good exists. However, a common mistake people make is assuming that absolute evil exists as well, which is not true. Tolkien was very clear on this point. There is only one true absolute good in his world, and that's Eru Ilúvatar. But evil isn't its own independent force. Instead, it comes from a fall, from those who were once good but fell from grace. Again, echoing Christian themes. Morgoth and Sauron were originally part of creation's divine order, but they rebelled against it. Even at their worst, they are not absolute evil. They are simply beings who have turned away from the original good. And that's an important distinction to bear in mind. Anyway, as I said earlier, Tolkien's world is deeply shaped by the themes of sin and hubris. Numenor's fall is absolutely a biblical allegory. Prideful men try to claim immortality and are punished for it. Gondor's decline is a result of arrogance, pride, and forgetting the wisdom of the past. Magic is tied to righteousness. Those who resist evil, like Aragorn and Frodo, receive divine aid, while those who seek power for themselves, like Saruman and Denethor, are corrupted and ultimately fall. Contrast this with A Song of Ice and Fire, where morality is much greyer, as I said earlier. I actually did a whole live stream on Ned Stark's character arc, which you can check out in the information cards, but Ned constantly faces choices that force him to compromise his morality. He has to prioritize certain values over others. And of course, despite being a good man, he ultimately fails in the main story. But in Tolkien's world, good people find a way through, and the story itself is shaped by divine morality and faith. And I'm pretty sure you can see what I'm driving at if you just consider the two very different deaths of Sean Bean. Okay, so what do we learn from this? Again, the takeaway here isn't that you should base your world on Christian mythology. Tolkien did that because that was his mythology. That said, he also borrowed heavily from Greek myths like Atlantis and the Norse legends, which were obviously not Christian. So it's not that he took just a single influence. But that's not the point. The point is, if you want your world to have a deep sense of spirituality or a moral divine framework, you need to build that into the fabric of your world. And I'm not talking about religion here. Heck, Tolkien didn't include religion in Middle-earth. Have you noticed that? There are no temple, no priests, no formalized worship. Because in his world, he didn't need them. The metaphysical reality of Eru Ilúvatar already permeates everything. And that's worth considering when you design your own world. I actually did a whole video on why metaphysics really matters in world building, which you can check out in the information card. If your world has a clear good versus evil struggle or a morality shaped by divine influence, then that needs to be woven into every aspect of your setting, not just its religion, but its entire structure. So, feel free to discuss in the comments, and I'm sure that discussion will be completely civilized and not controversial at all. Actually, I kind of hope it won't be, because, again, Engagement is good for the algorithm. So go ahead, have a lively debate about all of this in the comment. Just don't get too angry about it. At the end of the day, we're just talking about books and philosophy. No two readers interpret a book in exactly the same way, and that is okay. All right, let's move on to the final point. The rule of cool and why world building, for its own sake, is completely valid. At the heart of Tolkien's world building lies a very simple reason for why certain things are the way they are. Because it's cool. Because Tolkien himself loved it. Yes, his world building serves the story. Yes, it reinforces themes of decline and loss. Yes, it reflects his views on absolute good and the sin of hubris and pride and greed. But at the end of the day, Tolkien built his world before he had a story, because he loved his world. The Elvish languages exist just because. Tolkien didn't invent Elvish for plot reasons. He made it up because he was a linguist and was fascinated by the idea of a living, evolving language. And because he created so many dialects, he had to split the elves into multiple groups to justify all those linguistic changes. The language shaped the world, not the other way around. Middle-earth's deep history is not just a backdrop for Lord of the Rings. The Silmarillion isn't some world-building appendix. It's a standalone mythological epic. Tolkien wrote it for fun. The fact that most of it doesn't come up in Lord of the Rings doesn't matter. It makes the world feel richer, more alive, because we can feel Tolkien's love for it in every word. The ruins, the relics, the legends, they exist because they make the world cool. We don't need to know the full story behind Beleriand to appreciate Middle-earth's layers of lost history. We don't need to know every detail about Huan, the great hound of Valinor, to know that he was an absolutely legendary good boy. The ruins of Weathertop, the shattered remains of Gondor's past, the abandoned halls of Moria, they exist because Tolkien loved them. Now I know, I often say be careful of world builder's disease, and yes, you should be mindful of getting caught in endless world building if your goal is to write a story or run a game. But there is nothing wrong with creating something just because it's cool. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, adding things purely because you love them makes your world richer, and your love for your world will shine through to the people who explore your world, whether they're reading your stories or playing in your games. Not everything needs to serve the plot. Sometimes your deep lore exists just for you. Okay, so what did we learn today? Tolkien's world building is layered, but not in the same way as real-world history or even as A Song of Ice and Fire. Instead of a natural historical process, Tolkien uses a mythological one. And indeed, George R.R. Martin himself said in an interview that he loved Tolkien's world, but when he tried to build his own world, he wanted a more grittier world that was more married to history. And that's 100% fine. That's what he discussed in the previous episode. But Middle-earth is a grand mythology. Civilizations serve their thematic purpose within the mythic framework. Moral and spiritual forces shape history as much, or perhaps even more, than politics between different peoples. And some things exist just because they're cool and fantastical, because the world builder loves them. And how do you choose an approach between these two? That's a very personal question, and it's so story dependent. My advice would be to go with a historical model if you want political and economic forces to drive your history, and if you want something that's more ambiguous in terms of morality. And then use a world that's more mythic, like Tolkien's, if you want your fantastical forces to have a very direct hand in shaping your world. But when you do that, bear in mind, to make it really feel like Tolkien, you have to have that thematic element in your world building. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they draw from Tolkien's work is they just slap in the fantastical without giving it any of that thematic impact that Tolkien gave his races and his historical events. Okay, now that we have explored both grounded and mythic world building, in the next episode, we will get into the weeds and talk about how you create actual artifacts, conflicts, and other effects of ancient times that echo through to the current time of your story. So make sure you subscribe for that. And a very giant thank you to all of my members, especially the just-in-timers of the Build It in Stone level. Lupix Lakeshire, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna, and to my newest Build It in Wood members, Michael Fleck, Neil Buckley, and Moxane. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the thumbs up button and check out my video on how to create heroic myths in your world, or whatever the algorithm is recommending for you right now. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.